The Virgin Mary whispered, "My child, do not take the usual path tonight." Just as the rising floodwaters began to undermine the foundations of Interstate 10, Sarah Jenkins, battling crippling fatigue and the terrifying storm, knew her old car might not make the 50-mile drive to pick up her husband. The rain lashed the window like whips, and every fiber of her being screamed for safety, but the interstate route was the fastest way through the biblical torrent. Subscribe for more stories of faith, and tell us in the comments, have you ever heard a warning voice? The exhaustion of Sarah Jenkins was a heavy, suffocating blanket that evening, pressing down on her shoulders until she felt rooted to the worn kitchen floor. At 42, the demands of the library job, the constant needs of her 2 teenagers, and the relentless cycle of keeping a home together in rural Texas had taken their toll. Her eyes burned, dry and gritty, and she knew the fatigue wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual weariness that made her morning prayers feel like rote recitations instead of genuine connection. Outside, the world had dissolved into chaos. The storm had intensified past mere rain. It was a violent deluge, the wind sounding like a predatory animal scratching at the window panes. Flash flood warnings scrolled across the television screen, urgent and severe. She desperately wanted to stay curled up on the couch, to let the storm rage and simply wait for morning, but her husband, David, was stuck. His shift at the refinery was mandatory, and the company policy required immediate pickup, a 50-mile trip one way down Interstate 10. Sarah's old sedan was reliable, but only under blue skies. Tonight, the thought of navigating the blinding rain, the hydroplaning risks, and the sheer terror of driving a crumbling highway in a tempest made her stomach clench. Guilt warred fiercely with fear. She loved David and knew he needed her, yet the profound dread of putting herself in harm's way made her hesitate at the front door. "Lord, grant me strength," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, lost in the roar of the wind. She walked slowly into the living room, her steps dragging, and stopped before the small, familiar mantelpiece. There stood the statue of the Blessed Mother, a gift from her own grandmother, Our Lady of Sorrows, looking down with a gentle, compassionate gaze. Sarah automatically reached out, fingers tracing the cold ceramic folds of the Virgin's robe. She dropped to her knees, not because it was time for the rosary, but because she simply had no strength left to stand. "Mother Mary, please," she choked out, tears finally breaking through the wall of her exhaustion. "I am so tired. I am so afraid. Please, just get me through this drive safely." As she knelt there, head bowed low, the roar of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by an impossible stillness within her spirit. The air in the room grew warm, suddenly protective, like the feeling of being wrapped in a loving embrace. It was not a physical sound, but a voice, clearer than the ringing of the telephone, sharper than any thought she had ever manufactured. It resonated deep within the core of her being, gentle but firm, carrying the absolute authority of grace. "My child, do not take the usual path tonight. You must choose the quiet road." Sarah's breathing hitched, catching on the sudden profound silence that enveloped her small living room. The violent roar of the storm, which only moments before had been a deafening assault on the house, seemed to recede to a distant whisper, as if a great hand had been placed over the entire world. She was still kneeling before the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows, her fingers pressed against the cool ceramic, but the air around her was no longer cold. Instead, an unnatural, divine warmth bloomed, enveloping her utterly, banishing the paralyzing fear that had gripped her heart. She did not see a flash of light, nor did she witness any physical manifestation, yet the presence in the room was unmistakable, absolute, and holy. It was the direct, comforting voice of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Sorrows, speaking not to her ears, but directly to the deepest, most terrified chamber of her soul. My child, do not take the usual path tonight. You must choose the quiet road. The command was simple, utterly clear, and immediately calming. It carried no trace of judgment or anger, only pure, selfless instruction. Sarah knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this was not her own fatigue-induced imagining. This was intervention. Her tears, moments earlier born of dread, now flowed freely, hot with overwhelming relief and gratitude. She felt utterly naked before this holiness, yet completely protected. The spiritual weariness that had weighed her down for weeks lifted instantly, replaced by a quiet, resolute strength. She rose slowly, her legs steady now, her gaze fixed on the Blessed Mother's gentle face. The GPS on her phone, which lay on the counter, was stubbornly glowing, insisting on the fastest route, Interstate 10. Every ounce of her practical mind screamed that taking the secondary roads, County Road 54, would add 40 minutes to the journey, winding through even darker stretches of countryside where the flooding might be worse and help non-existent. Yet, the Virgin Mary's instruction was law. The fear of the storm was now secondary to the fear of disobedience. She picked up her keys, her movements deliberate and focused. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a strange, focused alertness. She knew, deep in her bones, that the interstate was waiting to claim her, and the Blessed Mother had just provided the only escape route. Stepping out onto the porch, the wind immediately tried to shove her back inside, and the rain instantly soaked her through. But Sarah felt a calm she hadn't experienced since childhood. She got into the old sedan, bypassed the interstate ramp without a second thought, and turned onto the narrow, poorly lit entrance to County Road 54. She was traveling slower, the journey was darker, and the road was less familiar. But she drove with the peace of someone who knew, without doubt, that she was being guided. She was on the quiet road, following a command that had saved her life before she even realized it was in danger. The sedan crawled along the back roads, the headlights barely penetrating the sheets of rain that hammered the windshield. County Road 54 was a twisting artery of asphalt, flanked by dense thickets of sodden oak and pecan trees. Sarah's tires gripped the slick surface, slower and steadier than they ever would have been on the high-speed interstate. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. She was now 20 minutes behind schedule, but the deep, abiding certainty of the Virgin Mary's instruction kept her focused. Suddenly, her phone, clamped in the dashboard holder, screamed an urgent, high-pitched alarm, cutting through the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. It wasn't a standard weather alert. It was an emergency civil notification, flashing red across the screen. Before she could read the text, the phone began vibrating with a frantic incoming call. It was Linda, her next-door neighbor. Sarah fumbled to answer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Linda, what is it? I'm driving." Linda's voice was strained, high with panic, thick with static. "Sarah, thank God. Are you home? Are you safe? Turn on the radio. Turn on the local news." "I'm almost halfway to David, on 54. What is going on?" "The bridge, the main overpass on I-10 near the river crossing. It's gone. The flooding, Sarah, it just collapsed. They're saying several cars went down, maybe a whole truck. The news chopper is trying to get there, but it's mayhem." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles were white, the sedan momentarily drifting toward the shoulder. She slammed on the brakes, pulling over onto the muddy verge. The rain continued its furious assault, but she barely noticed. She didn't need the radio. The realization hit her with the physical force of a tidal wave. The bridge Linda was describing was the exact, massive concrete structure that carried Interstate 10 over the Brazos River tributary. It was the crucial central point of her usual commute. She calculated the time in her head. Had she followed the GPS, had she ignored the warm, insistent command of the Blessed Mother, she would have been crossing that bridge at this precise moment. The moment the structural integrity failed, the moment the road gave way beneath the weight of the water and the vehicles. She fumbled the phone, dropping it onto her lap, and stared blankly through the wet glass.
The emergency alert remained on her screen, now displaying the terrible words, I-10 bridge collapse, multiple fatalities confirmed. A deep, guttural sob escaped her throat, a sound of horror and overwhelming, staggering relief. She leaned her
head against the cool, wet steering wheel, shaking uncontrollably. She had argued with her GPS. She had doubted her own sanity. She had resented the extra time, yet she had obeyed the quiet road. The Mother of God had not simply diverted her, she had pulled her from the very precipice of death. The collapse wasn't a warning for the future, it was the danger she was meant to avoid right now. The quiet road was the one chosen by grace. Sarah lifted her head, tears mingling with the rain running down her face, her breath catching on silent praise. She was alive, spared by a love so profound it had manifested as a whispered command in the midst of a violent storm. The dread was gone, replaced by a profound, tearful awe at the reality of divine intervention. The tears that streamed down Sarah's face were no longer born of fear, but of profound, cleansing gratitude. She reached out, her hand shaking, and pressed the end call button, needing silence to absorb the monumental reality of the last 30 minutes. She was alive. She had been on the verge of driving into a cavernous, flooded abyss, and the Virgin Mary had reached across the boundaries of time and space, whispering a command that saved her life. The storm still raged, but Sarah felt an impenetrable stillness within the car. The exhaustion was utterly gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She understood now that her weeks of spiritual weariness had not been a sign of abandonment, but a prelude to the deepest form of protection. Even when her prayers felt hollow, even when her faith felt thin and stretched, she had been held. The divine saw her fatigue, knew her fear, and intervened with a precise, targeted act of mercy. She closed her head, bowing her head in the small space of the sedan, and spoke aloud into the darkness, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Blessed Mother, thank you." It was the truest prayer she had ever uttered, a spontaneous explosion of faith born from the terrifying reality witnessed on her phone screen. The road she had resented for its length and darkness was, in fact, the path illuminated by grace. The added 40 minutes were the precise amount of time needed to ensure she arrived at the moment of collapse, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a witness to the active, present power of God. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a covenant renewed. Her life had been touched undeniably by the holy. She realized that moments before the voice, she had been asking for strength merely to endure the trip. Instead, she had been given the strength to change the trip, steering her away from a fate sealed by the elements. It was a powerful lesson that we are never left to navigate our tempests alone. Even when the world feels chaotic and our own spirit falters, a higher guidance is watching, often speaking in the quietest voice just when the danger is loudest. The fear of the rain, the fear of the dark, the fear of the long drive, all those anxieties dissolved, replaced by an astonishing, resolute hope. She was a mother, a wife, a librarian, and tonight she was a recipient of a miracle. This realization was not meant to be kept to herself. It was meant to be carried forward, a testament to the ever-present love and watchful care of the divine. With a final deep breath, Sarah put the car back into gear, merging slowly back onto the quiet road. She was still heading toward her husband, but now she was traveling with a renewed purpose, wrapped securely in the knowledge that she was walking, driving, in the shelter of the Almighty. The quiet road was truly the safest path of all. Sarah continued her journey on County Road 54, the initial shock giving way to a profound, quiet worship. When she finally reached the refinery parking lot, the rain had diminished to a soft, respectful drizzle.
David, seeing her pull up, rushed toward the car, his face a mask of worry. He slid into the passenger seat, immediately wrapping his arms around her. "Sarah, I was terrified. Did you see the news? The I-10 collapse. I called your cell a dozen times, but it kept going straight to voicemail. I thought—" Sarah held him tightly, shaking her head. "I know, David. I saw it. I was meant to be there." She pulled away just enough to look into his eyes, the weight of the miracle settling between them. Slowly, deliberately, she recounted the moment she knelt before the statue, the suffocating fatigue, the sudden, impossible stillness, and the clear,
and damnable voice that ordered her onto the quiet road. She spoke of the GPS insisting on the faster route, and the terrible realization that the delay of 40 minutes was the margin of grace that had saved her life. David listened, his expression moving from confusion to sheer, silent disbelief, and finally to utter awe. He reached out and gently touched the damp shoulder of her coat, as if to confirm she was physically real. The collapse was reported exactly 20 minutes after you left the house. If you had gone the usual way— His voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. They sat in the quiet car, the engine idling softly, the silence punctuated only by the distant, weary sirens of emergency vehicles rushing toward the devastation she had been spared. Sarah leaned her head against David's shoulder, a deep, abiding peace settling over her spirit. The fear of the world had not vanished. The tragedy on the highway was real, but her fear of her place in it was utterly gone. She had been chosen, protected, and loved by a figure who saw the path ahead and cleared the way. The Virgin Mary's watchfulness was not a distant promise. It was a physical, life-altering reality. She closed her eyes, remembering the warmth that had filled her living room, the immediate lifting of her weariness, and the simple, firm command, "You must choose the quiet road." It was a reminder to all believers. Even when we are too exhausted to ask properly, even when doubt whispers loudest, the divine is already at work, paving a quiet road for our protection. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more stories of faith and divine intervention. Share this video with someone who needs a miracle today.